Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. The smell of smoke and blood hadn't left the house, no matter how many windows I opened, or how much air seeped through the cracks of the boards we had nailed across them. The attack had ended 2 days ago, yet the scent still clung to everything. Burned wood from the barricades that had been set on fire, the sour metallic stench of the infected we had dragged outside and burned in shallow pits, the faint oily odor of the gunpowder we'd used up far too quickly. When I stepped out into the yard that morning, my boots sinking slightly in the damp earth, it felt as if the property itself had absorbed the aftermath and was refusing to let go. I moved slowly along the fence line, pausing at each trap to see what had survived. Most had been destroyed outright, torn down by the infected or damaged when the raiders pressed in behind them. One of the tripwires was dangling loose where someone had stepped hard on the anchor point, bending the post until it leaned at an awkward angle. I crouched low and pressed the wire back into place, glancing up at the forest every few seconds as I worked. The trees stood silent, just like they had on the night of the attack, their shadows stretching out toward the fence like they might reach through if given the chance. There was no movement now, but the quiet was deceptive. I didn't trust it. The yard was a graveyard of makeshift defenses. Sections of chain link sagged inward, where the infected had pressed against it with such force the steel had buckled. Wooden planks lay scattered in the mud, broken ends splintered from frantic hammering and sudden impact. The barricades that had once stood as our last line of defense now looked like rotting teeth in a half-collapsed jaw. When I stepped back inside, the house felt even smaller than it had 30 days ago. Ryan was sitting at the kitchen table with his head bent over a cup of water, his hands resting on the table as though he didn't quite trust them to hold the cup steady. He had started sharpening the machete earlier, but abandoned the effort, the blade lying beside him untouched. Laura was on the living room floor, crouched beside Daniel as she tried to coax him into eating a piece of stale bread. The boy sat cross-legged, silent, his face pale in the morning light as he chewed reluctantly. He'd grown thinner in the last month, though it wasn't like any of us were eating well enough to keep the weight on. I set the rifle against the wall and told Ryan I'd reset the outer tripwires, at least the ones we hadn't lost completely. He only nodded, staring at the tabletop as though it might provide some answer neither of us had. "We're almost out of nails," he said finally, voice flat, "and half the stakes are splitting." He wasn't wrong. The idea of leaving the property again so soon after the attack churned in the pit of my stomach, but patching the same defenses with weaker materials wasn't a solution. We were holding the property together with scavenged screws and duct tape, and it was only a matter of time before the next attack found every weakness. We spent the rest of that day repairing what we could. Laura helped me reinforce the barricade at the back door while Ryan took Daniel out into the yard, showing him how to recognize the tripwire cans and how to avoid triggering them by accident. Daniel followed instructions quietly, nodding when asked a question, but otherwise staying silent. I hated seeing him out there, but I also knew we couldn't keep him locked inside a room while we worked. If he was going to survive this world, he needed to start learning the why behind every line we strung and every board we nailed over a window. By nightfall, our hands were raw from hammering and tying knots, but the property felt no safer. I stayed up for my watch even after the others had fallen asleep, sitting in the upstairs hallway near the window with the rifle laid across my knees. Every small creak of the house felt like it came from something outside. I stared at the yard until my eyes burned, expecting the fence to buckle in on itself at any moment. The next morning, I told Ryan we had to leave the property. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "You're sure about that?" he asked, not out of disagreement but because he already knew what leaving meant. "We're down to less than 2 weeks of food," I said. "The outer fence won't hold another hit like the last one. We need supplies, and we need materials. Staying here and hoping it doesn't happen again isn't a plan." Laura didn't like it either, but she didn't argue. We decided that Ryan and I would go while Laura stayed behind with Daniel. She was getting better with the pistol, good enough to hold out in the bunker if someone, or something, came for them while we were gone. Packing for the trip was a mechanical process. Spare ammunition, rope, crowbars, water bottles already running low. We filled the SUV with everything we might need and drove out just after dawn. The engine coughed to life reluctantly, and I found myself hoping the fuel would last long enough for us to reach at least a handful of properties before we had to turn back. The roads were worse than I remembered. Branches had fallen across them in several places, forcing us to creep into the gravel shoulders to get around. Burned-out cars sat abandoned at odd angles near intersections, their doors left wide open as if the drivers had been pulled out mid-flight. We passed the remains of old checkpoints set up at the start of the outbreak, now nothing more than twisted metal barriers and shredded tarps flapping in the wind. The first farm we reached had already been stripped. Cupboards stood open and empty, drawers pulled out onto the floor, the barn doors wide to reveal nothing but cobwebs and old hay. We found a few rusted tools and a length of decent rope, but nothing worth the risk of hauling. The second property was better. The house itself looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There were canned vegetables still in the pantry, a sack of potatoes sprouting pale shoots in the corner. Ryan found a box of nails and a few rolls of duct tape in the garage, and carried them back to the SUV with a small grin that faded the moment we remembered why we were there. We were loading the trunk when the first sound reached us. A low, drawn-out groan carried across the field. I froze with a bag in my hands and turned toward the tree line, scanning for movement. Ryan set down the box of nails and moved to the front of the SUV, pulling his pistol from his waistband. I didn't have to tell him to be quiet. The silence between us was instinctive. Then the first infected stepped out from the trees. It wasn't alone. Two more followed, their clothes hanging in tatters from their twisted frames. They moved with that uneven, jerking gait I had seen too many times, their eyes darting from us to the SUV as they closed the distance. "Get in," I said, low and sharp, and Ryan didn't hesitate. I shoved the last bag into the trunk and slammed it shut as the first infected broke into a run. It hit the side of the SUV just as I threw myself into the driver's seat, its hand smearing dirt and blood across the glass as it clawed for the handle. Ryan fired once through the half-open window, and the infected dropped, twitching. The others were already on us. I jammed the accelerator down, the SUV lurching forward as the tires spun in the dirt. The infected clung to the bumper for a few seconds before peeling away, their fingers leaving ragged scratches in the paint. Neither of us spoke for the next 20 minutes. Ryan kept the pistol on his lap, knuckles white around the grip, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror as though the infected might still be following. "They're starting to move in groups," he said finally. "I know," I answered. When we pulled up the driveway, Laura was waiting in the yard with Daniel just behind her. She didn't ask if we had found enough. The way we looked told her everything she needed to know. We spent the rest of the day inventorying the new supplies and dividing the food into smaller portions. It wouldn't be enough. It had never been enough. I had always prepared for such problems when the world was still holding together, but I certainly didn't expect to be living them out like this. I loved this house, the property, and all the work I had put into fortifying it. But I was also a realist. I could see the situation clearly now. We were far too vulnerable here. Every attack left us weaker. Every scavenging trip drained us further. And every day the infected seemed to push closer. We needed a more secure place to live. Somewhere we could not only hold out but truly defend. That thought had been lingering in my mind for days. And over dinner, I finally said it aloud. The conversation was quiet at first. Daniel sat on Laura's lap, chewing slowly as if he understood more than he should for his age. Ryan frowned down at his plate. He didn't argue the point, though. None of us needed convincing. The house and yard we had fought so hard to maintain had become a trap, and we all knew it. Laura was the first to speak. She said that if we did move, we needed to think beyond just shelter. We would need a vegetable garden, something that could keep us fed in the long run. Ryan added that we needed a proper lookout tower wherever we ended up, somewhere high enough to see threats coming from a distance. I agreed with both ideas, but pointed out that we couldn't just walk away blindly. Before we committed to abandoning the property, we needed to know what was out there. I suggested going into the city within the next few days to assess options. It was risky. Everyone understood that. But as I reminded them, our street would only become harder to defend, as more infected and desperate survivors drifted through. The neighborhood was already too empty, and emptiness invited predators. That night I lay awake in the attic, watching the tree line in the pale glow of the distant fires. My mind kept circling back to the city. It had been weeks since we'd ventured that far. I had no illusions about what we might find there, but the thought of staying here without a plan was worse. The next morning, Ryan and I walked the perimeter in silence. The traps were holding for now, but the fence leaned heavily in several places, and the wire was fraying in others. We patched what we could with what little we had left. Laura stayed inside with Daniel, sorting the remaining supplies and planning how long the food might last if we stretched it as far as possible. By mid-afternoon, we gathered around the kitchen table and sketched out a plan. We would make the city trip in 2 days, using the SUV to get as close as possible before continuing on foot if necessary. The goal was simple: find potential shelter sites and assess whether any of them were viable. We also needed to locate a source of supplies that could sustain us for longer than a few weeks at a time. Laura volunteered to stay behind with Daniel again, and I knew she was doing it not because she wanted to, but because she understood the boy needed someone here he trusted. Ryan would go with me, carrying as much as we could safely bring back if we found anything worth taking. The following day was spent preparing. I serviced the rifle, replaced the bolts in my pack, and checked the machete's edge. Ryan scavenged what nails and wood he could to reinforce the barricades while we were gone. Laura spent the evening walking Daniel through the steps of hiding in the bunker if things went bad. It was a hard conversation to overhear. That night, I found Laura in the kitchen after Daniel had gone to bed. She was sitting in the dark, arms wrapped around herself. "If you don't come back," she said quietly, "I don't know what I'll do." "You'll come back here and lock that bunker door," I told her. "You'll protect him, just like we planned." She nodded but didn't look convinced. We left at first light, the SUV's tires crunching on the gravel driveway as we pulled away from the property. The road was eerily quiet, devoid of even the occasional infected wanderer we had seen in previous weeks. We passed through abandoned neighborhoods where mail still sat in rusted boxes and children's toys lay scattered in yards. It felt as though the world had been frozen in place mid-collapse. The closer we got to the city, the worse the destruction became. Burned-out cars clogged intersections, forcing us to drive on sidewalks and through back alleys. We saw buildings with entire walls collapsed, blackened by fire. The smell of decay was stronger here, the kind that clung to the back of your throat no matter how hard you tried to ignore it. We parked the SUV behind a row of overturned delivery trucks and continued on foot, moving slowly and staying low. Ryan held the shotgun I had loaned him, scanning every alley and rooftop as we advanced. My rifle stayed slung across my chest, the strap tight against my shoulder. The first shelter site we found was a disaster. It had been a community center, once fortified by whoever had claimed it after the outbreak. Now the barricades were broken, and the walls were covered in black smears, where fire had licked upward. We stepped over bones scattered across the floor, and didn't linger. The second site was a warehouse on the edge of an industrial district. The outer gate was intact, and the building itself appeared structurally sound, but there were signs of recent activity: food wrappers, a burned-out campfire, footprints in the dust. We debated investigating further, but decided against it. There was no telling who might still be using the place. As we moved deeper into the city, the signs of danger multiplied. We spotted at least a dozen infected over the course of the next hour, most moving alone, but a few drifting together in loose packs. The groups were the most concerning. We hid in a burned-out gas station as one pack shuffled past, their limbs jerking awkwardly as they sniffed at the air. It was late afternoon when we reached the building that changed everything. The hospital stood at the edge of the city's core, a monolithic structure surrounded by chain-link fencing. Someone had made a serious effort to fortify it, and from a distance it still looked imposing. But as we crept closer, we saw the telltale signs of collapse. Gaps in the fencing where bodies had pushed through, dark stains leading from the entrance out into the parking lot. Ryan pointed to the second floor, where a row of windows had been smashed out. "Could be worth checking," he whispered. I hesitated. Hospitals had been the epicenter of the chaos in the early days, and I didn't like the idea of walking into one now. but the building was large, and if we could reclaim it, it might solve every problem we faced. We climbed through a broken window at the rear of the building and found ourselves in a hallway littered with medical equipment. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a damaged pipe. Every step echoed too loudly in the empty space. The first infected appeared at the far end of the hallway, emerging from behind a tangle of overturned gurneys. Its jaw hung at an unnatural angle, and it lurched toward us without hesitation. Ryan raised the shotgun, and the blast reverberated through the building as the creature crumpled. That shot drew others. We fought our way through the first floor, firing carefully and retreating when the numbers became too much. By the time we reached the stairwell, my rifle was nearly empty, and Ryan's hands were shaking from reloading the shotgun. The second floor was quieter, but it was clear the building couldn't be made safe in a single trip. We found some supplies, medical kits, canned food hidden in staff lockers, but we both knew we couldn't bring everyone here yet. The infected were too numerous, the building too large to secure alone. By the time we made it back to the SUV, the sun was setting. We drove home in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts about what we had seen. The hospital was a risk, but it was also the best option we had found. When we pulled up the driveway, Laura and Daniel were waiting in the yard. Laura's relief was obvious, though she tried to mask it. That night, as we sat in the dim light of the kitchen, I laid out what we had discovered at the hospital. "We can't stay here forever," I said, my voice low, the lantern's glow flickering against the peeling walls. "If we can clear that hospital, it could be the secure base we need, but it's going to take planning, and it's going to be dangerous." No one said anything immediately. Ryan sat hunched at the table, his hands wrapped around a cup as though the act of holding it gave him something steady to cling to. Laura was silent, watching me with the faintest trace of apprehension, but there was also a clarity in her expression, as if she had already come to terms with the inevitability of what I'd just said. Daniel had fallen asleep in the corner on the thin mattress we kept laid out for him, blissfully unaware of the decisions that were weighing on us. Ryan finally nodded, his eyes darting from me to Laura. "We don't really have another choice," he said quietly. I knew he was right. The next morning, we woke with the same unspoken tension hanging between us. I started the day the same way I always did, walking the perimeter with Ryan to check traps and patch up weak points in the barricades. The fence looked worse every day. It sagged in several places, wires fraying like old rope. We patched what we could with what little we had left, but it was obvious these makeshift repairs were buying us time and nothing more. Laura stayed inside with Daniel, organizing our dwindling supplies and rationing food down to the smallest portions. We had perhaps 2 weeks' worth left if we stretched it, and there was no guarantee we'd be able to find more before then. It was mid-afternoon when Laura suddenly appeared at the door, waving me inside with urgency. "Someone's coming up the road," she whispered. I grabbed the rifle from its place by the door and moved quickly to the upstairs window, careful not to make any noise as I peered out. 2 figures approached the property from the tree-lined road. The first was a tall man who was clearly struggling. His left arm was missing entirely, the shirt sleeve tied off at the shoulder with a dirty strip of cloth. He leaned heavily on a long branch he was using as a makeshift walking stick, dragging himself forward with uneven, deliberate steps. Beside him walked a young woman, maybe 20 at most. She was lean, carrying a small pack strapped tight to her shoulders, and she glanced behind them every few moments as though expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the trees. Ryan appeared beside me at the window, jaw set as he watched the pair slowly approach the fence. "We can't let them get any closer," he said under his breath, gripping the shotgun tightly. I didn't answer immediately. The man raised his remaining hand slowly, palm open, when they were close enough to the gate. His voice carried up to us, ragged but steady. "We don't want trouble," he called. "We're just passing through." We waited, watching their every movement. The girl looked down at the ground, her shoulders tense, though I could see her eyes darting up at us every so often. "Who are you?" I asked finally, loud enough to be heard. "My name's Cal," the man answered. He shifted his weight on the walking stick and gestured slightly toward the young woman. "This is my daughter Mara. We used to be with a group, a bad group. We'd been with them since the beginning, but I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't watch what they were doing. Raiding, hurting people, taking whatever they wanted. I left last night, and we've been walking ever since. He hesitated, then looked up at me with something like urgency in his expression. I just wanted to warn you. A few days ago, during one of their raids, one of their scouts spotted this place. I saw it too. They know you're here now. I don't know what they're planning, but I figured you should know before it's too late. Ryan leaned closer to me. We can't let them in, he muttered, voice low and hard. We don't know them. We can't take that risk. I shared his hesitation. Strangers meant unpredictability, and unpredictability could get us all killed. But Laura stepped forward before I could answer, her voice steady. We need to hear them out, she said firmly. If what he's saying is true, we might not survive the next attack. We need all the help we can get. Ryan shook his head sharply. Strangers aren't welcome here. Not now. You know what bringing them inside could mean. Laura didn't back down. She listed every reason she could think of. The growing number of infected, the threats from the group Cal had described, the simple fact that we were running out of options. She turned to Ryan and told him flatly that if there was another attack, we might not make it. Now they were both looking at me, trying to convince me. I could feel the weight of their stares, but I kept my focus on the pair by the gate. My gut told me no. I didn't want to let anyone in, but I also knew Laura was right about one thing. We were at a breaking point. We needed every advantage we could get, and if these two were telling the truth, they could give us information we didn't have. Our conversation dragged on for nearly 10 minutes. Cal and Mara couldn't hear what was being said, but it was obvious they could see we weren't happy. Cal eventually turned, as though he'd had enough, and raised his voice. We've done what we came to do. We warned you. We'll be on our way now. Something in the way he said it gave me pause. I stepped forward and called out, Wait, you said you have information about that group. If you're telling the truth, if you're willing to share what you know, you can stay. But understand this, we're not staying here. We're moving on, and if you come with us, you'll have to work with us. Cal and Mara exchanged a quick glance. I added, It's your choice, but if you want to survive, we might be your best chance. The girl hesitated, then looked at her father. He gave a small nod, clearly exhausted. All right, Cal said. We'll join you. But I wasn't finished. There's one condition, I told them. No firearms until we know we can trust you. That's non-negotiable. Mara immediately bristled. We can't defend ourselves without weapons, she said sharply. Cal put a hand on her shoulder before I could respond. It's better this way, he said quietly to her. We'll earn their trust. She didn't like it, but she didn't argue again. That night, after they had eaten and we'd set up a place for them to sleep on the floor of the living room, we talked about the next steps. The hospital was still our only real option, and Cal agreed it was worth the risk. He also gave us a clearer picture of the group he had left behind. 20 people, armed and desperate, holding the ruins of a highway rest stop not far from here. They would come for us sooner or later. We set out for the hospital the next morning, with all 6 of us. Cal moved slowly with his injury, leaning on the walking stick with each careful step, and Mara stayed close to him, scanning the horizon with a watchfulness that reminded me of my own. Ryan and I carried most of the gear. Laura walked with Daniel, who clutched her hand as though afraid she might slip away. The hospital loomed on the horizon like a dark monolith, unchanged from when Ryan and I had last seen it. We entered through the same broken rear window, weapons drawn, moving cautiously through the silent corridors. The smell was the same as before, stale, metallic, laced with the faint rot of old blood and the infected who still lingered within. Our first day was spent clearing the lower floors. We moved slowly, methodically, dispatching infected with knives and hatchets whenever possible to avoid drawing more to us. Mara proved herself capable despite her youth. She moved with quiet precision, checking corners before stepping through, her jaw set with determination. Cal, even with one arm, was resourceful, using a crowbar to pry open doors and jam stairwells when needed. By the end of that first day, we had secured a cluster of rooms on the second floor, and barricaded the stairwell with furniture we dragged from nearby offices. We returned home under cover of darkness, exhausted but encouraged by the progress we'd made. The next days blurred into a relentless rhythm. Each morning we returned to the hospital, pushing deeper into the building. We dragged bodies into corners, blocked hallways with overturned gurneys, and secured doors behind us. The hospital was enormous, and every floor we cleared felt like barely a dent in its sprawl. We scavenged what we could as we worked: medical kits, canned food hidden in staff lockers, a few gallons of sealed water. Every find felt like a small victory, enough to keep us going despite how dangerous the work was. The infected were relentless, and we lost count of how many we had to kill. There were close calls that left us shaken, corridors where we nearly found ourselves surrounded, stairwells where we could hear them moving below us as we worked. Some nights we barely spoke when we returned to the house. We ate in silence, our muscles aching, and fell asleep the moment we lay down. By the 9th week, we had cleared the last wing of the 3rd floor. It was there we found evidence of the hospital's final days. Patient beds chained to walls, desperate messages scrawled in blood across whiteboards, rooms filled with bodies that had never made it out. Standing in the dim light of that hallway, I realized how far we had come and how far we still had to go. We were no longer just trying to survive from one day to the next. We were building something bigger, a chance at safety, at a future. By the time we cleared the last wing of the hospital, the sense of progress was overwhelming. The building was massive, and it had taken nearly every ounce of strength we had left to comb through each floor. But we had done it. The infected were gone, at least for now. We had barricaded the main entrances, reinforced stairwells, and blocked off exposed hallways with a mix of heavy furniture, steel bars scavenged from collapsed sections, and anything else we could drag into place. There was another thing we noticed during those final days of clearing. We hadn't seen another living soul since the day Cal and Mara had first arrived at the property. No sign of hostile survivors, no distant figures watching from the tree lines. Nothing. Only infected, and even those seemed to wander sporadically now, easy enough to avoid or eliminate. It was the first true relief I had felt in weeks. We knew the next step was moving everything from the old house. We couldn't afford to leave valuable supplies behind. I decided I would make those trips myself at first, and I specifically asked Cal to come with me. It wasn't that I distrusted him, not anymore, at least not in the way I had when he first appeared, but I wanted the chance to understand him better. The man had lived through the same nightmare as us, but his experiences with his old group could teach me things I didn't yet know. And if I had to measure him one more time before we fully relied on him, now was the time. Cal agreed without hesitation. Mara looked uneasy about him leaving, but he told her she needed to stay behind with Ryan, Laura and Daniel to help secure the hospital in their absence. We left at dawn with an empty pickup we had scavenged from a nearby parking garage, heading toward the property that had been home for the first month of the outbreak. The first trip back was strange. I'd lived in that house for years, fortified it with my own hands, and fought tooth and nail to keep it standing. Now, returning after all this time, it felt small, vulnerable. The yard was overgrown, traps broken and scattered where they had been triggered and left unrepaired. I half expected to find the place ransacked, but it was untouched, as if even the infected had no interest in it anymore. We worked methodically, loading everything of value into the truck, crates of ammunition, the few weapons I had left cached in the bunker, boxes of canned food, clothing, and tools. Cal moved slower with his missing arm, but he was steady. He didn't complain once. On the second day, as we drove back to the hospital with another full load, Cal pointed at a line of abandoned cars on the side of the road. "We're going to need fuel," he said. "This truck won't run forever, and those stations we passed on the way here aren't working for a reason." I knew he was right. Most of the gas stations had gone dry weeks ago. I'd seen people drain them with whatever tools they could find in the early days of the collapse. But Cal explained that just because a station's pumps weren't running didn't mean all the fuel was gone. "You can siphon from the underground tanks," he said. "The pumps don't work without power, but the fuel's still sitting there. We just need a hand pump, some hose, and a few containers." That afternoon, He showed me exactly how to do it. We stopped at a station on the edge of the highway and searched the storage shed until we found a manual pump and a few lengths of hose. The tanks were underground, hidden beneath thick metal lids we pried up with a crowbar. It was careful, messy work. We fed the hose into the tank and worked the pump slowly, listening to the faint gurgle of fuel rising through the line. After a few minutes, the first gallon splashed into the container we had set on the ground. It was a small victory, but it felt massive. "We'll hit every station we pass from now on," Cal said. "Even a few gallons at a time adds up." Over the course of that week, Cal and I grew closer, driving the empty roads together, loading supplies from the old house, siphoning fuel from abandoned stations. It gave us time to talk. He told me more about the group he had fled, the things he had seen them do to people who were weaker or less prepared. He admitted that he had been part of it too, at least at first. "You do things to stay alive," he said quietly one evening, as we tied down another load in the truck bed. "Things you think you can live with. Then you wake up one day and realize you can't." I believed him. By the end of the week, we had cleared everything from the old property. I took one last walk through the house before we left for good, the rooms echoing with the absence of what had once been there. The barricades were stripped away, the furniture gone, the shelves bare. It felt strange to stand there and know I would never come back. But the hospital was better. It was safer. When we returned to the hospital with the final load, the others were waiting at the entrance. Daniel ran to hug my leg, and Laura's relief was obvious even as she tried to hide it. Ryan and Mara helped us unload the truck while Cal explained what he had taught me about fuel. In the following days, we shifted our focus entirely to building the hospital into something we could truly defend. Ryan and I worked on reinforcing the stairwells and setting new trap lines near the outer entrances. Laura and Mara organized the living spaces, setting up sleeping areas, a cooking station, and an improvised system for collecting rainwater on the roof. Daniel helped where he could, though we tried to keep him busy with tasks that wouldn't put him in danger. Cal's knowledge of fuel storage allowed us to keep the truck running and even power a small generator we had salvaged. For the first time since the outbreak began, we had lights at night, at least in a few rooms. It felt like a luxury, a small reminder of the world we had lost. Those days were exhausting, but productive. We moved through the hospital with a sense of purpose, reclaiming it piece by piece. We hung blankets over exposed windows to keep the light from spilling out, double-checked the barricades, and stored supplies in the most secure rooms. There were no signs of other survivors, and the infected we encountered near the hospital were few and easily dealt with. It was almost enough to make me think the worst might be behind us. On the 12th week, as I stood on the roof with Cal watching the distant tree line, he said something that stayed with me. "They'll come eventually," he said quietly. "The group I left behind. They'll remember this place, just like I did." I didn't need him to explain further. I already knew what he meant. It wasn't enough to have cleared the hospital and made it livable. We needed to turn it into a place that could withstand anything. A fortress, one capable of holding off the infected and the inevitable arrival of hostile survivors. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, I sat alone in the dim glow of the generator-powered lantern and began sketching out what the next steps would need to be. Securing the perimeter was at the top of the list. The hospital was big, with multiple entry points that could be breached if someone, or something, pushed hard enough. We needed fencing, barricades, and choke points. We needed to know exactly who was coming and going at all times, and for that, we needed supplies. The next morning, I laid out my plan to the group over breakfast. There was an old construction hypermarket on the outskirts of the city, as well as several unfinished houses nearby that had been abandoned when the outbreak started. If we could salvage wood, steel fencing, nails, concrete blocks, and any tools left behind, we could build a perimeter worthy of the effort we had already put into this place. I had scouted the hypermarket weeks ago when I was still operating out of the house, but back then, it had been too dangerous to attempt alone. The parking lot had been crawling with infected, and I hadn't been able to risk getting pinned down without backup now. With more people to watch my back, the odds were different. Cal volunteered immediately, and Ryan agreed after a moment of hesitation. Mara wanted to go too, but Cal told her to stay behind and help Laura keep watch over Daniel. We set out at first light, keeping to back roads and alleys as we drove. The SUV had become invaluable, and I was constantly aware of the dwindling fuel supply we had managed to siphon from the gas stations. The hypermarket was a sprawling, warehouse-style building surrounded by rows of rusted shopping carts and cracked asphalt. From a distance, it looked abandoned, but I knew better than to trust appearances. We parked behind a line of delivery trucks that had been left to rot in the loading bay and moved quietly to the front entrance. The glass doors were shattered, and the first thing that hit me as we stepped inside was the smell. Damp air laced with mildew and the faint, lingering odor of decay. The aisles stretched out into the gloom, half-collapsed shelves spilling boxes and tools onto the floor. We advanced slowly, scanning for movement, stepping over fallen debris as we went deeper into the store. There were infected inside. There always were, but we handled them quickly. A few lurched out from behind a stack of lumber. Others wandered aimlessly in the power tool section. We took them down silently with crowbars and knives whenever possible, saving our ammunition for emergencies. By the time we finished clearing the building, I was sweating despite the chill in the air. The store was a goldmine, rolls of chain-link fencing, pallets of cement bags, rebar, boxes of screws, hammers, handsaws, and even a few power tools we could run off the generator. We loaded as much as we could into the truck bed and promised ourselves we'd return for the rest in the coming days. From there we moved to the nearby housing development, where dozens of unfinished houses stood like skeletal remains of a neighborhood that would never be completed. The frames were sturdy and full of usable materials. We stripped doors, windows, wood planks and piping, working quickly but carefully. At one point, Ryan paused, staring at the horizon with his shotgun raised, convinced he'd seen movement. We froze for a full minute, hearts pounding, but nothing emerged from the shadows. We returned to the hospital late in the afternoon, the truck bed piled high with salvage. The others met us at the entrance, relieved to see us back in one piece. Mara and Laura helped us unload the materials, while Daniel hovered close by, asking quiet questions about where everything had come from. That night, we discussed how best to use what we had gathered. The next days became a blur of hard labor. We erected chain-link fencing around the hospital grounds, anchoring it with the concrete and steel we had salvaged. We built watchtowers from the lumber, giving us elevated vantage points over the parking lot and the tree line beyond. Choke points were established at the main entrances, reinforced with barricades of cement-filled barrels and overturned vehicles. It wasn't just about defense. We also started to think about how we could sustain ourselves long-term. Laura suggested using the flat roof of the hospital for small-scale farming. We collected soil from the unfinished housing development and began filling raised planters built from scavenged wood. We planted potatoes, onions, and a few other hardy vegetables that wouldn't need too much care. Water was another priority. We rigged up a rainwater collection system on the roof using plastic sheeting and pipes scavenged from the construction sites. It wasn't perfect, but every drop we could save was a drop we didn't have to risk our lives to find later. During this period of building and organizing, 3 more people arrived at the hospital. The first was an elderly woman named Margaret, a former nurse who had once worked here. She had come in search of medicine, hoping that some had been left behind. When she realized the hospital had been cleared and fortified, she asked if she could stay. The other 2 were brothers, young Korean men in their early 20s named Jin and Sun. They had been surviving on their own since the beginning, scavenging from town to town. They looked wary when they first approached, but when they saw the hospital's defenses and heard we had space, they accepted the invitation. Margaret immediately proved invaluable, helping us catalog the medical supplies we had recovered from the hospital and teaching us basic first aid techniques. Jin and Sun were strong, capable, and willing to work. They joined Ryan and Cal in reinforcing the perimeter and building additional defensive structures, their experience scavenging in dangerous places evident in the way they moved and watched their surroundings. It was during this time that we realized winter was coming earlier than usual. The nights grew colder with each passing week, and the days were shorter than they had been before. We began hoarding firewood and insulating the rooms we used with whatever materials we could find. Blankets were hung over doors, and Margaret showed us how to seal the windows with plastic and tape to keep the warm air inside. The hospital slowly began to feel less like a ruin and more like a stronghold. We had sleeping quarters set up in the second and third floors, a communal kitchen where we cooked what little food we had left, and a system for guarding the perimeter around the clock. But I never forgot what Cal had said on the roof. They would come eventually. Every improvement we made, every piece of fencing we erected, was a silent acknowledgement that we might have to defend this place, not just from the infected, but from the living. On the 15th week, as I stood on one of the newly built watchtowers watching the pale winter sun set over the tree line, I felt a sense of pride in how far we had come. But there was also a gnawing awareness that the challenges were only beginning. The cold was seeping in earlier than expected, and every day we spent fortifying the hospital, every improvement we made, carried the unspoken understanding that it could all be tested at any moment. Ryan volunteered to take a scouting trip the next morning. He had been itching to get out beyond the perimeter for days, restless from the constant construction and watch duties. He wanted to search deeper into the residential neighborhoods beyond the city's edge, places we hadn't had the manpower to check when we first moved to the hospital. I didn't argue. Supplies, especially ammunition, were running low, and we needed every advantage we could find before the worst of winter set in. He returned at dusk, his face pale from the wind and his clothes dusted with snow, but he was smiling, really smiling, in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. "You're not going to believe this," he said, pulling me aside as the others gathered around to unload his pack. Ryan had stumbled upon a house that had belonged to a former military man, tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac half hidden by overgrown pines. He had been thorough, searching every room carefully, and it had paid off. In the basement and garage, he'd found a cache of weapons, rifles, pistols, boxes of ammunition, and most importantly, a modern military portable radio. I felt a surge of cautious excitement as he described it. We had old handheld radios we used for short-range communication, but nothing like this. This was a serious piece of equipment, capable of reaching out far beyond our immediate area. That night, after the others had gone to bed, I sat at the workbench we had set up in one of the hospital's storage rooms, with the radio in front of me. I'd used less advanced versions before, basic models for local chatter and emergency monitoring. But this was something else entirely. I turned it over in my hands, scanning the dials and controls, trying to piece together how it worked. For weeks it became my project. Whenever I wasn't helping with guard duty or repairs, I was at that bench, testing frequencies, experimenting with the antenna, and poring over an old field manual Ryan had found with the cache. It wasn't easy. Every mistake felt like wasted time, but gradually, slowly, I started to understand it. It was during one of those long evenings at the bench that Mara first joined me. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me adjust the dials. "You've been at that thing for hours," she said softly. "Does it even work?" I glanced up at her, shrugging. "I'll know soon enough. But if it does, it might be the most important thing we've found since this all started." She stepped closer, curiosity clear in her eyes. Over the next several nights, she began spending more time in that storage room while I worked. Sometimes she asked questions about the radio, about how the different settings worked. Other times, she simply sat nearby, keeping me company as I scribbled notes and listened to the static-filled silence. There was a quiet comfort in those evenings, a break from the constant strain of survival. Mara was sharp, quicker to pick up on details than I expected, and her presence made the endless trial and error feel less like isolation. We began to talk about things that had nothing to do with radios or scavenging, fragments of our lives from before everything fell apart. Those conversations made the hospital feel just a little less cold. Finally, on a frozen evening at the end of the 18th week, the static broke. I had been cycling through frequencies for over an hour when a faint voice came through the speaker, crackling but unmistakable. I froze, twisting the dial carefully until the words sharpened. "Repeat. This is Echo Ridge Settlement, calling out to anyone in range. We are secure and stable, requesting contact with any other survivors. Over." My hands tightened around the mic. "This is..." I hesitated, then gave the name of our group and location as broadly as I could without being too specific. "We read you, Echo Ridge. Over." There was a long pause, the static stretching like a wire pulled too tight, and then the voice returned, clearer this time. "We hear you. We're located approximately 100 miles south. Can you confirm your position? Over." I didn't confirm our exact location, not yet. I kept the exchange cautious, learning what I could without giving away too much. They claimed to be a community of nearly 50 people, fortified in an old manufacturing plant. They had a surplus of food, but they were short on medical supplies and fuel. When the transmission ended, I set the mic down slowly, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. We weren't alone anymore. That night, I told the group about the contact. There was a mix of relief and apprehension around the table. Laura looked hopeful for the first time in weeks, but Ryan was visibly wary. "We don't know who they really are," he reminded everyone. "We have to be careful." I agreed, but even as I spoke the words, I couldn't deny the possibility that this could change everything. Mara found me later in the storage room, standing over the radio again. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped closer and rested a hand lightly on my arm. "You did it," she said softly. I looked at her and nodded. There was a warmth in her eyes I hadn't noticed before, a flicker of something beyond simple gratitude. As the wind howled outside the hospital and the cold seeped deeper into the building, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. It could drive you forward, give you purpose, but it could also make you reckless. Over the next week, I spent hours at the radio each night, keeping contact with Echo Ridge. The conversations were short and cautious. I never gave them our exact location, only broad directions. But slowly, through careful questioning, I learned more about them. They were indeed fortified in an old manufacturing plant and had roughly 50 people. They described themselves as self-sufficient, though their supplies of medical goods and fuel were dwindling. We agreed on a tentative barter, fuel for food and information. We had fuel, thanks to Cal's knowledge, and they had far more food than we could produce with our small rooftop planters and rationed stores. It was a risk, but it was one we couldn't ignore. The group gathered one evening in the hospital's former staff lounge to discuss the plan. Ryan was reluctant. "We don't know who these people are," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "We show up with fuel, and they could just take it from us." "They could," I admitted, "but they might not. If we do nothing, we'll keep scraping by, and winter's just going to get harder." Laura nodded in agreement. "We need this," she said quietly, "and we need to start building relationships with others out there. We can't live like we're the last people on Earth." It was then that Mara spoke up. "I want to go," she said, her voice steady despite the flicker of surprise it caused around the table. Cal immediately shook his head. "No, absolutely not. It's too dangerous." Mara didn't flinch. "I can handle myself, and I know you'd rather it was you going, but you can't make the trip with your arm the way it is." "You're my daughter," Cal said, his voice hard. "I'm not letting you walk into something that could get you killed." Mara's expression softened, but she didn't back down. "I'm going," she said simply, and there was nothing Cal could say to change her mind. I watched the exchange, torn between understanding Cal's fear and recognizing Mara's resolve. She was one of the most capable people we had. "Finally," I said, "all right, Mara comes with me, and we'll need a third person. Jin, would you be willing?" Jin, who had been quietly listening, nodded. "I'll go." Cal looked at me, his jaw tight, but he said nothing more. The days leading up to the trip were marked by tension, but also something else. Mara and I began spending more time together, not just at the radio, but in the small moments between duties. She would join me on perimeter checks or linger with me on the roof after guard shifts, watching the barren tree line swaying in the wind. One night, while everyone else was asleep, we found ourselves in the storage room where the radio was kept, the low hum of the generator filling the silence. Mara stood close, her shoulder brushing mine as we checked over the gear for the trip. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly. "I'm thinking about the barter," I admitted, "about what could go wrong." She was silent for a moment, then touched my arm lightly. "You're always thinking about what could go wrong, but we're still here, aren't we? That's because of you." I turned to face her, and for the first time, I saw the depth of the connection we had built since Cal and Mara had joined us. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic. It was a slow recognition of trust and shared survival. We kissed for the first time that night, a quiet, unspoken affirmation that we weren't as alone as we had once believed. The morning of the trip, we loaded the SUV with the fuel containers we had painstakingly filled over the last month. The cold air bit at our faces as we secured the cargo and double-checked our weapons. Jin climbed into the back seat with a rifle slung across his chest, while Mara took the passenger seat beside me. Cal stood near the gate, his expression unreadable as we prepared to leave. He stepped forward and gripped my shoulder before I started the engine. "Bring her back," he said simply. "I will," I promised. The drive was long and tense. We avoided major roads as much as possible, cutting through backcountry paths and narrow forest trails. The landscape around us was bleak, snow clinging to the edges of empty fields, abandoned cars rusting in ditches, the occasional infected wandering aimlessly in the distance. Mara kept a map open on her lap, tracing the route we had planned with her finger. "We're close," she said as we approached the coordinates Echo Ridge had given us. "Another 20 miles maybe." I glanced at her and saw the same mix of determination and anxiety I felt. We were walking into the unknown. As we drew nearer, we switched off the headlights and approached the settlement on foot. The manufacturing plant loomed ahead, its high walls lined with barbed wire and makeshift watchtowers. We were spotted almost immediately. Armed figures called down from the towers, ordering us to halt. I raised my hands, calling out who we were and why we had come. After a tense minute, the gates creaked open just enough to let us in. Inside, Echo Ridge was exactly what they had described. Organized, fortified, and bustling with activity. Dozens of people moved through the plant's interior, carrying supplies, tending fires, and patrolling the perimeter. It was overwhelming after so many weeks of isolation. We were brought to a large room where the settlement's leaders met us. They were cautious but cordial, inspecting the fuel containers we had brought before presenting the food they were willing to trade. Bags of dried grains, canned vegetables, and even some fresh produce grown in their own greenhouses. As we completed the exchange, I asked careful questions about the world beyond their settlement. They shared what they knew about other survivor groups, infected movements, and the changing conditions as winter tightened its grip. Jin stayed close, scanning the room with quiet watchfulness, while Mara remained at my side, her presence grounding me in the midst of so many unfamiliar faces. By the time we left Echo Ridge, the SUV was packed with more food than we had seen in months. The leaders gave us directions to return safely, and while they didn't ask for our exact location, I knew it was only a matter of time before curiosity might lead them to it. The drive back was quieter. Jin dozed in the back seat, and Mara leaned her head against my shoulder as I navigated the icy roads. When we finally saw the outline of the hospital rising through the trees, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Cal was waiting at the gate when we arrived. Mara was the first out of the SUV, running to hug him, and I saw the relief in his eyes as he held her close. We unloaded the food into the storage room and gathered everyone together to show what we had brought back. The mood in the hospital that night was lighter than it had been in months. For the first time, we weren't just surviving. We had a small margin, a sense that tomorrow might be slightly better than today. But I couldn't ignore the questions echoing in the back of my mind. We had reached out into the world again, broken the wall of isolation that had kept us safe. That connection with Echo Ridge might turn out to be the best thing we had ever done, or the mistake that would bring everything crashing down around us. The hospital was warmer than usual that night. Everyone crowded into the old cafeteria where a fire had been built in the improvised wood-burning stove. The smell of food filled the space, real food for once, and it lifted the group's spirits. Daniel sat near Laura, holding a plate of rice and beans like it was a rare treasure. Jin and Sun were laughing quietly in a corner with Ryan and Cal as they shared stories from the trip. For a few hours, we could almost forget the world outside the walls. But when the fire burned low and the group dispersed, Mara lingered. She walked with me down the dark hallway that led to the radio room. Her hand brushed mine as we walked, and I didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight neither of us spoke aloud. In the days that followed, Mara and I found ourselves seeking each other out more often. She helped me with the rooftop garden, her breath visible in the cold air as we cleared snow off the planters and checked the makeshift rainwater collection barrels. She joined me on perimeter watches, and we talked quietly in the shadows about things other than survival, the books we had once read, the places we had wanted to see before the world had ended. One night, after a long day of work fortifying the outer fencing, we were sitting alone in one of the hospital's old offices, the generator's low hum filling the silence. Mara reached out and touched my arm lightly, the same way she had in the radio room weeks before. "I'm glad it was me who went with you," she said softly. I looked at her and knew what she meant. The trip to Echo Ridge had changed something between us. We became lovers in the quiet, unspoken way that often happens when life hangs by a thread. There was no ceremony, no declarations, just a recognition of the connection that had been growing since the day she had first stepped into the hospital with her father. It was a comfort neither of us had expected to find, and in the bleakness of winter, it felt like a small act of defiance against the cold and the fear. Cal noticed, of course. He didn't say anything directly, but I saw the way he looked at me whenever Mara and I were together. He was protective of her, and I couldn't blame him. But Mara was no longer the uncertain young woman who had first arrived at our gates. She was capable, strong, and fully able to make her own choices. As winter deepened, the hospital became a hive of activity. We worked tirelessly to keep the perimeter secure. The chain-link fencing we had erected in the fall was holding up well, but we added additional barriers, rows of sharpened stakes along the outer edge, more watchtowers built from scavenged lumber, and reinforced gates. Ryan and Jin led a team to gather more supplies from the nearby construction sites, while Sun and Cal helped me dig shallow trenches around the fences to deter any infected from pressing too close. Margaret, the elderly nurse, focused on organizing the medical supplies with Laura's help. Even Daniel pitched in, carrying small bundles of wood from the lower floors to the kitchen, eager to contribute. It was hard work, but it gave us purpose. And as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, that purpose was what kept us going. We had food, we had fuel, and for the first time in months, we had a sense of control. But the outside world hadn't gone away. One morning, during a routine perimeter check, Ryan spotted something disturbing. Fresh footprints in the snow just beyond the fence line. They weren't ours, and they hadn't been left by a lone wanderer. There were at least 5 distinct sets, leading from the forest toward the hospital and then back again. "They were watching us," Ryan said grimly when he brought me to the spot. "They came close enough to see the watchtowers, the fencing. Then they left." I crouched down and examined the tracks. They were deep and crisp, left within the last day. Whoever it was had moved with purpose, circling the perimeter without attempting to breach it. Cal was with us, and his face was pale as he looked at the evidence. "It's them," he said quietly. "The group I told you about. They're scouting you now, just like they used to scout other places before they attacked." That night, the group gathered in the cafeteria. The atmosphere was heavy, every voice low. "We can't let fear paralyze us," I told them. "We've worked too hard to make this place secure, but we need to be ready. If they decide to come for us, they won't just knock on the door. We have to assume they'll hit us hard." Ryan agreed. "We can't stay reactive anymore. We need to plan for this." We set up a schedule of around-the-clock watches from the towers and reinforced the gates even further. The fuel we had traded with Echo Ridge was precious, but we began running the generator longer so that we could power floodlights along the perimeter at night. Even with these precautions, there was an unspoken tension in the airs. People jumped at shadows, and every crack of ice outside the windows set nerves on edge. Mara was a steady presence through it all. She stayed close, working alongside me as I checked traps and maintained the radio. We talked quietly during watch shifts, her presence calming the restless churn of my thoughts. One night, as we sat together in the radio room, the static filling the space, she leaned against me. "You think they'll come soon, don't you?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. "I think they're already deciding how," I said finally. She nodded, her hand finding mine. "Then we'll be ready, all of us." Despite the tension, we made another barter run to Echo Ridge at the end of the 23rd week. This time, I wanted Mara with me. She was steady under pressure, and she understood the importance of what we were doing. Cal tried to talk her out of it, his voice low and urgent as he argued with her near the gate. "You don't have to go," he said. "Let someone else take the risk." Mara shook her head. "I'm going. This is about the group, Dad. It's about us having a future. I can help." Cal's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. He simply turned to me and said, "Bring her back again." Jin joined us on the trip, his quiet competence a comfort as we loaded the fuel containers and prepared to make the drive south. The roads were treacherous with ice, and we moved slowly, scanning every tree line for signs of danger. When we arrived at Echo Ridge, the settlement's leaders were relieved to see us. The trade went smoothly, though I noticed more guards than before, and a heightened sense of caution in their voices. The world was getting colder and hungrier by the day, and even strong communities like theirs were feeling the strain. We left with another load of food and information about nearby infected movements, but the unease followed us all the way home. Back at the hospital, we unpacked the supplies and updated the group on what we had learned. Cal's relief at seeing Mara safe was obvious, but so was his worry. He knew, as we all did, that every trip outside the walls carried risks we couldn't always predict or control. That night, Mara and I sat on the roof together, watching the frost form on the fencing below. She leaned into me, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to get through this," she said. I held her closer, staring out at the dark tree line beyond the hospital's perimeter. I wanted to believe her, but the unease had become something heavier now, like a storm cloud refusing to break. 2 days later, the storm finally arrived. It began in the early hours, just as the sky was starting to pale with the first weak light of morning. Sun was on watch from one of the towers when the faint crunch of boots in the snow broke the usual silence. He froze, scanning the tree line. Shadows shifted between the pines, and then he saw them. 6 figures moving with purpose, weapons slung over their shoulders. He raised the alarm, and the hospital came alive in seconds. People scrambled to the watchtowers and barricades, the air thick with the brittle cold and the sound of hurried footsteps. I grabbed the rifle from where it leaned near the radio room and took my position near the main gate, Mara beside me. The bandits didn't rush us. They moved with the same patience Cal had described weeks ago when he told me about his former group. They stopped just short of the floodlight's edge, watching us from behind the trees. "Show yourselves," I called out, my voice carrying across the frozen ground. No one answered. Ryan appeared at my side, shotgun gripped tightly. "They're testing us," he muttered, "seeing how we react." He was right. They disappeared back into the forest after a few tense minutes, but the message was clear. They knew where we were, and they weren't going to stop. The group gathered in the cafeteria afterward. Faces were pale, voices hushed. "We can't just sit here and wait," Ryan said, his frustration bubbling over. "They're going to hit us sooner or later. We need to take the fight to them." "And walk straight into whatever trap they've set," I countered. "No, that's exactly what they want." Cal, sitting near the back with his arm folded against his chest, spoke up. "They won't hit you until they're sure they can win. That's how they work. They'll watch, they'll probe for weaknesses, and then they'll strike when they think you're at your weakest." Winter was making everything worse. The cold was relentless, and despite our best efforts, our supplies of firewood and food were running lower than anyone wanted to admit. People were tired, and tension inside the hospital was building. Small arguments flared into shouting matches over chores and rations. Even Laura, usually calm and steady, snapped at Ryan during one of these flare-ups, accusing him of being too reckless on watch. I tried to hold the group together, but I could feel the fractures forming. Every night, as I stood on the roof scanning the dark woods, I felt the same gnawing truth. We couldn't hold this place alone if the bandits came in force. That was when I decided to contact Echo Ridge. I waited until the hospital was quiet, then switched on the radio and tuned to the frequency we had used during our trades. It took nearly 15 minutes before someone responded, the static breaking into a voice I recognized as one of their leaders. I explained the situation carefully, laying out the evidence of the bandits' presence and the likelihood that they would attack us soon. "You know as well as I do that if they overrun us, they'll eventually find you," I said, "and they'll come after your settlement with our supplies and weapons. We can't let that happen." There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, the leader spoke. "We're willing to send help, but we can't commit to a battle we don't have to fight. We'll send a team to cover you, to keep the bandits from gaining ground. But in return, we want half your fuel and half your medical supplies." I gripped the mic tightly. "That's a steep price," I said, though I already knew we didn't have much room to negotiate. "It's the only way we can justify the risk," the voice replied. I took a deep breath, thinking of the faces downstairs, of Mara and Daniel, and everyone else who had worked so hard to build this place. "Fine," I said finally. "We'll make the trade." The leader confirmed that they would send 10 people within 2 days. They wouldn't engage the bandits directly, but they would ensure that we weren't overrun. When I shut off the radio, Mara was standing in the doorway. She had been listening. "You did the right thing," she said softly as I turned to face her. "Did I?" I asked. "We just gave away half our fuel and medical supplies. That's going to hurt us." Mara stepped closer, her hand brushing mine. Not as much as losing everything would have. I let out a slow breath and nodded. She was right. The next 48 hours were some of the longest of my life. We reinforced the gates, reset every trap, and doubled the watch rotations. The snow kept falling, muffling the world outside, making it even harder to hear if someone was moving in the forest. On the second night, Echo Ridge arrived. 10 people slipped into the hospital under cover of darkness, heavily armed and disciplined. Their leader, a woman with sharp eyes and a scar running across her cheek, laid out their plan. They would remain hidden in the woods, shadowing any bandit movements and ensuring the attackers couldn't surround us. It was a relief knowing they were out there, but it didn't erase the tension. Everyone in the hospital knew the bandits could appear at any moment. Mara and I barely slept. We spent the long nights on the watchtowers together, her presence a steadying force as the wind cut through the gaps in our clothing. Sometimes we spoke quietly about nothing important, trying to keep the fear at bay. Other times we just stood in silence, watching the tree line. The bandits came at dawn on the third day. They emerged from the trees like shadows, spreading out across the snow with the same calculated patience as before. But this time, they didn't stop at the floodlight's edge. They advanced. The first shot rang out from one of the watchtowers, and then the world exploded into chaos. We returned fire from the towers and the gates, but the bandits were experienced. They used the trees for cover, pressing closer with every volley. I caught glimpses of Echo Ridge's team moving through the woods, cutting off flanking attempts and forcing the attackers back without engaging in a full assault. It felt like hours, though it was probably less than one. When the bandits finally retreated, they left behind 2 bodies in the snow. We didn't cheer. We knew this wasn't over. That night, I contacted Echo Ridge again to thank them. "They'll be back," their leader warned me. "And when they do, they'll be even more determined. You need to be ready for that." I knew she was right. As I set down the mic, I felt Mara's hand slip into mine. "We'll get through it," she said quietly, echoing the words she had spoken on the roof days before. I squeezed her hand and nodded, though the dread that had rooted itself inside me wasn't going anywhere. I could see it in everyone's faces as we moved through the hospital halls that night. The attack had only been a test, and now that the bandits knew we had something worth defending, they would be back. And next time, they would throw everything they had at us. The snow was falling hard when the final assault came. It was early morning, still pitch black, when Jin's voice cracked over the radio from one of the eastern towers. "They're here, all of them." I ran to the nearest watch point, the wind biting through my coat as I climbed the icy steps 2 at a time. From the top, I could see them moving through the tree line like a tide of shadows, their numbers far greater than the probing force we'd repelled days earlier. There were at least 20, maybe more, and this time they came armed with more than rifles. The first grenade exploded against the outer fence, a flash of orange light against the white snow, shaking the ground beneath us. The sound of it seemed to tear through the entire hospital, jolting everyone into frantic motion. "They've got grenade launchers," Ryan shouted as we ducked behind the barricades. Another blast slammed into the fence on the southern side, ripping apart the chain link and sending debris flying. Then, we saw the armored personnel carrier, a police vehicle they must have scavenged from some long-abandoned station, grinding through the snow toward the main gate. Its tires crushed the first layer of barricades we had set, the plow-like front end shoving aside the sharpened stakes we'd buried in the ground. I shouted into the radio for Echo Ridge, my voice barely audible over the gunfire and explosions. "We need you now." Echo Ridge answered within seconds. "We're already moving in," came the terse reply from their leader. "Hold your ground. We'll cut off their retreat." We didn't have time to respond. The bandits had reached the perimeter. Floodlights illuminated their faces as they surged through the breach in the fence, weapons blazing. The battle was unlike anything we had experienced before. Bullets tore through windows and ricocheted off the concrete walls of the hospital as we fired back from the towers and upper floors. The snowstorm that had cloaked their approach was now turning against them, limiting visibility and muffling their shouted commands. Margaret, the nurse, had been helping transport the wounded from one of the towers when a grenade detonated nearby, sending shrapnel through the corridor. She never got back up. Jin died minutes later, holding the line at the southern gate when the armored carrier crashed through the secondary barricades. He stood his ground long enough for the rest of us to fall back, his rifle barking in the blizzard until a bullet caught him in the chest. We had no time to mourn. The bandits were inside the perimeter now, using the hospital's lower floors as cover as they advanced. We fell back to the second floor, reinforcing doors and stairwells with whatever we could find. Mara stayed close, helping me set charges along the hallway entrances. Her hands were steady, her face pale but resolute. "They're not going to stop," she said as we secured the last barricade. "I know," I said. "That's why we can't either." The bandits pushed hard, but the storm was their undoing. Echo Ridge's team, hidden in the whiteout beyond the tree line, cut off their reinforcements and kept them from surrounding the hospital. Every time the attackers tried to regroup, they were picked off in the snow. By late afternoon, the fight was all but over. The bandits who hadn't been killed in the initial push were retreating back into the forest, dragging their wounded through the drifts. But a handful remained trapped inside the hospital's lower levels, cornered by our barricades. We didn't show them mercy. We dragged them into a supply room one by one, demanding to know where the rest of their group was holed up, how many were left, and whether they had any other allies. Most broke quickly, the fear of dying in the blizzard forcing the truth out of them. When we had the information we needed, I made the decision no one wanted to speak aloud. We couldn't risk leaving them alive. Mara stood beside me as I carried it out. She didn't flinch, and she didn't look away. When it was over, we dragged the bodies outside and left them for the snow to cover. The aftermath was devastating. The eastern fence had been destroyed. One of the watchtowers was a smoldering ruin, and a section of the hospital's first floor was nothing but shattered concrete and twisted steel. We had lost Margaret and Jin, and Echo Ridge had lost 3 of their own despite their efforts to avoid direct combat. Sun, Jin's brother, was inconsolable. He worked silently alongside Ryan and Cal through the night, helping to move the debris and repair what could be repaired, but I could see the grief in every movement, in the way his eyes lingered on the places where his brother had once stood. Echo Ridge's leader met with me before their team left. "You did what you had to do," she said, her voice low. "They won't trouble you again, and if they had won, they'd have come for us next. You were right about that." We gave them the agreed-upon supplies, half our remaining fuel and medical stores, but this time it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like an investment in survival. That night, the group gathered in the cafeteria. The atmosphere was quiet, heavy with grief, but also something else. Determination. We had endured the worst and held our ground. I stood at the back, Mara's hand in mine, watching as Ryan comforted Laura and Daniel. Cal sat nearby, his face drawn, but when our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. We had survived 30 weeks of the apocalypse, and we had done it together. But as I looked out at the battered faces around me, I knew survival wasn't enough anymore. We needed to rebuild, to make the hospital stronger than it had ever been, because the world outside wasn't going to get any kinder, and we would be ready for whatever came next. As I stood on the roof later that night, watching the storm clouds part to reveal a pale moon, Mara stepped up beside me. She leaned her head against my shoulder, silent for a long moment. "We're still here," she whispered finally. I nodded, staring out at the horizon. "We are," I said, "and we're going to stay here, no matter what it takes." The cold wind swept across the hospital grounds, carrying with it the quiet promise of more challenges ahead. But for now, at least, we had won, and that was enough. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.